March 6, 1945. Cologne Cathedral Square, 3:47 p.m. Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann laid his eye on the periscope of his Panther tank and saw the impossible. What was supposed to be another Sherman moving through the rubble revealed abnormal proportions. A larger turret, a longer barrel, a menacing posture. Das ist kein Sherman, he whispered into the intercom. That sentence, almost a sigh, marked the beginning of the collapse of a belief fueled by 3 years of absolute technical mastery. It was believed that the Americans did not know how to make heavy tanks. And more, it was believed that they did not even need to, because they only won by quantity. That certainty was about to be destroyed. For years, the Tiger I and King Tiger represented not only the pinnacle of German engineering, but the symbol of invulnerability on the battlefield. It was a myth forged in steel, maintained by numbers and fed by propaganda itself. But what the Germans didn't know, and what the tankers most feared to find out too late, was that Detroit had woken up, and not just with force, but with an answer. This is the account of when arrogance met the industry, of when the 90mm gun spoke, and German invincibility fell silent. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any field image. Only 20 Pershing tanks saw actual combat in Europe. 20. And yet they caused more German tank abandonments than whole weeks of combined offensives. More than physical destruction, they caused hesitation. They discredited doctrines. A single well-aimed shot from a 90mm gun, coming from a tank that the Germans didn't even know existed, had more psychological effect than 1,000 Shermans advancing en bloc. And that's the point. The Wehrmacht tankers didn't know what they were up against. They thought it was just a modified Sherman, perhaps a makeshift variant. What they saw, in fact, was the harbinger of the end. If you value this type of accurate reconstruction, based on data and technical sources, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps the channel continue to reveal what the official story often hides, the details that changed the war without making a fuss. In August 1942, on the outskirts of Leningrad, the metallic sound of heavy chains and roaring engines heralded the arrival of something that would change the perception of armored warfare, the Tiger farce. Tall, imposing, with a menacing silhouette and an 80mm gun that seemed disproportionate, it was not just a new vehicle, it was a new steel doctrine. On that eastern front ravaged by mud, cold, and constant friction with Soviet forces, the Tiger demonstrated a trait that would redefine battlefield fear. It didn't have to retreat. It was armored to withstand what the enemies could offer, and armed to destroy them before they even got close. Its frontal armor, up to 120mm, made it virtually invulnerable to most enemy shells at regular combat ranges. The 88mm KWK-36, derived from the legendary anti-aircraft flak, pierced Allied armor at more than 2,000 meters. For the first time, German crews felt that they commanded not just a vehicle, but an invincible entity. The legend of Tiger was born like this, not with advertising, but with results. In the North African campaign, in the forests of Normandy, and in the fields of Belgium, it became synonymous with death at a distance. Allied crews began to report combat with Tigers, even when facing inferior models such as Panzer IVs or Panthers. This phenomenon has earned a name among Americans: Tigerphobia, an anticipated panic that undermined tactical decisions even before the first shot. In many cases, it was enough for a German vehicle with a similar silhouette to appear to provoke immediate withdrawals or requests for disproportionate reinforcements. Fear did not have to be justified by reality. Belief was enough. It was a psychological war won without shooting. At the center of this belief was German engineering. With millimeter precision, tight tolerances, and high-performance materials, the Tiger was seen as the pinnacle of the war machine. And it was. But its cost reflected this. Each unit required about 300,000 marks to build, 3 times that of a Panzer IV. A Tiger wasn't just hard to beat on the field. It was difficult to manufacture, maintain, and transport. Its weight of 57 tons made it difficult to cross, destroyed bridges, and jammed frequently. The firepower was unquestionable, but its mobility and operational reliability were limited. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Detroit operated on a different logic. America had converted all its industrial capacity to war. The goal was not to produce perfect machines, but enough ones, in quantity, reliability, and speed, for every Tiger built. The U.S. produced dozens of M4 Shermans. And while technically inferior, these tanks could be replaced in the field with a speed the Germans could never keep up with. The proportion of production between the two countries was absurd. For every Tiger delivered to the field, American arsenals placed approximately 30 Shermans on the front lines. By 1944, the U.S. was producing more than 2,600 tanks per month. Germany? Less than 300. This is one of the most ignored and most devastating statistics of armored warfare. American tank production was almost 10 times higher than German in 1944. If this surprises you, write in the comments. Logistics wins, because that's the essence of this story. But the Wehrmacht generals, intoxicated by the performance of their Tigers, continued to operate under a different logic. The logic of the unsurpassed weapon, the logic of invulnerability. And for a while, it seemed to work. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944, the commander of a single Tiger, Michael Whitman, destroyed 14 British tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 auxiliary vehicles in less than 15 minutes. This type of feat fed the mythology. German heavy tanks began painting death rings on the barrels like Luftwaffe fighters scoring victories. The morale of the crews grew. Trust became doctrine. The statistics reinforced the belief. But there was a question that almost no one asked themselves within the German war machine. What if the enemy was also evolving? What if American industry, the one they believed was large but limited to mass production, was quietly developing something different, something that combined the two worlds? Numerical efficiency with technical sophistication? This question was never answered in time, because German trust was blind. They believed that if the Americans had something as powerful as a Tiger, they would have used it by now. They believed that the absence of American heavy tanks was a choice, not a technical limitation. And this assumption was the fatal mistake. What the Germans called the Sherman with a long barrel was already in the European theater, and it had already destroyed Panthers and Tigers in direct combat. But what they didn't know was that that long barrel hid a new doctrine. It hid a turnaround. The Pershing was among them, silent, disguised, lethal. In the next part, we will look at how American industry, fragmented into 22 states and with more than 300 subcontractors, secretly orchestrated the creation of a machine that not only killed tanks, but dismantled doctrines. And when the first shot from the Pershing went through the turret of a Panther in Cologne, it wasn't just the steel that broke. It was the sound of an era that was coming to an end. While the German High Command cemented its faith in custom-made heavy tanks, America responded with a radically different concept: scale production, mechanical efficiency, and speed. The center of this revolution had a name: Detroit. In 1940, it was the world capital of the automotive industry. By 1943, it was the largest war production complex on the planet. Automakers such as Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler abandoned civilian models to produce airplane engines, artillery parts, ammunition, jeeps, trucks, and above all, tanks. The Grand Blanc tank arsenal, operated by GM's Fisher Body division, began producing Shermans. But behind the standardized appearance, a new industrial capacity was developed, that of converting any line at any time. The doctrine was not glamorous, it was mathematics. Do it fast, do it in bulk, make it work. In just months, factories that previously produced Buick bodies began to mold heavy armored turrets with unprecedented casting techniques. Each tank wasn't just a weapon, it was the end product of an interlocking supply chain between 22 states, 300 subcontractors, and more than 50,000 workers. The Americans designed with a clear objective: to keep the production line running without interruption. If a part was not available from one supplier, it would be redesigned for another. The result was a flexible, resilient, and surprisingly modern system. Unlike Germany, which produced the Tiger in small workshops on demand, the United States was setting up lines where a full tank could be finished in less than 12 hours. In 1944, the Grand Blanc arsenal alone produced 11 tanks per day. The comparison is brutal. Germany has never been able to keep more than 100 Tigers monthly. Meanwhile, the U.S. produced about 2,200 tanks of all types each month. The question was no longer whether Americans could catch up with German technology. The question was how long it would take to match quality without sacrificing quantity. And that question was already being answered before the Germans even knew it. The T-26, the name of the project that would later give rise to Pershing, arose from this strategic awareness. It was not an isolated experiment. It was the next step of a machine already at full speed. The T-26 program involved multiple simultaneous lines, different engines, new suspension systems, sloped armor, and the integration of a new gun, the 90mm M3, derived directly from the Allies' most successful anti-aircraft artillery. The proposal was clear: to combine the mechanical reliability of the Sherman with enough firepower to face any German armored vehicle. To do this, American factories have reinvented their own processes. Components were produced in a modular fashion, which allowed the chassis to be assembled in one plant while the tower was cast in another. The assembly logistics were so precise that tanks were shipped disassembled by ship and finished in field workshops in Europe in less than 72 hours. American engineering did not seek to impress. It sought to work. The tank needed to walk, shoot, resist, and be easy to repair. And the Pershing did all of this, with a cannon that the Germans were not prepared to face. From the German point of view, this transformation was invisible. The Reich had underestimated not only American production, but its ability to adapt. OKW intelligence was convinced that the Americans had adopted the Sherman for everything doctrine as a technical limitation, not a strategic choice. Meanwhile, in practice, America had reconfigured its entire economy for a war of attrition, where even losses were absorbed by volume. Each Sherman destroyed could be replaced in days. Each lost crew would be trained with standardized manuals and mechanical simulators. Scale was the new weapon, and it was about to be paired with something the Germans couldn't accept: an American heavy tank with enough firepower to pierce the Tiger's armored soul. What makes all this more ironic is that the German plan has always been to win by quality. The problem is that quality without replacement turns into scrap on the field. The Wehrmacht invested in complexity. The United States invested in replicability. Each screw, each bearing, each optical assembly of the Pershing could be exchanged for an identical one from another factory with expected tolerances. There was no room for artisanal improvisation, and that changed everything. Because the battlefield isn't an engineering contest, it's a maintenance race, and the Americans knew how to run. At the end of 1944, with the first Pershings ready, the trains began to cross the Atlantic. The operation was carried out under absolute secrecy. The tanks were sent in camouflage, registered as heavy maintenance equipment. The crews, trained at Fort Knox, had been instructed not to comment on anything, not even to soldiers from their own army. When they arrived in Europe, they were integrated into the Sherman units, hidden in plain sight. It was a strategy of technical infiltration. The enemy would only realize what was happening when it was too late. And it was. By January 1945, while the Germans were still counting on their armored supremacy, the first M26s were ready for combat. They didn't have to be many. They just had to be in the right place, with the right cannon, against the right enemy. But the enemy did not yet know what was coming. Little did he know that that long barrel in the distance wasn't a version of what they already knew. It was something new, designed to defeat them. And when the first shot of this new cannon crossed the battlefield at 853 meters per second, the impact was not only physical, it was symbolic, because for the first time since 1942, German tanks heard the sound of something they couldn't easily kill. In the next part, we will see what was on the other end of the line: the Sherman, the tank that sustained the American war up to that point, and whose limitation forced the birth of the Pershing. The story of a tank that won by insistence, but never by fear, and for that very reason, it had to be overcome. From the beginning of the war, the M4 Sherman became the armored face of the United States. It was light for a medium tank, reliable on the ground, and mechanically simple to produce. Its design prioritized fast maintenance, ability to navigate uneven terrain, and interoperability with the U.S. logistics chain. It was the common soldier's tank, agile, standardized, and infinitely replaceable. But there was a problem. Its 75mm M3 gun, effective against infantry and light armor, proved inadequate against the new German armor standards. When the first Shermans faced the Tiger I in Tunisia in 1943, the disadvantage was obvious. The 75mm shell did not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor, not even at distances of less than 500 meters. By contrast, the German 88mm destroyed Shermans more than 2 kilometers, often before the Americans even saw the enemy. The American doctrine, based on mobility and volume, had been built on the idea that tanks should not face other tanks. This task would fall to tank destroyers and artillery. The Sherman, in theory, was supposed to exploit gaps, support infantry, and avoid direct confrontations with heavy vehicles. In practice, this turned out to be a miscalculation. The reality of European combat, especially in Normandy and on the Western Front, forced the Shermans to face exactly what they were not supposed to be: Panthers, Tigers, and well-placed anti-tank guns. The losses were severe. It was common to destroy 4 or 5 Shermans for every Tiger neutralized. The war of attrition imposed by the Wehrmacht exposed in the open the limit of American thinking. Mobility lost to lethality, mass production lost out to reach, and the 75mm cannon, although reliable, became a symbol of an era that was being left behind. The American command knew this. So did the crews. There was an informal name that circulated among the soldiers: Ronson, in reference to the lighter of the time, whose slogan was, "Lights up the first time, every time." The reference was bitter. Shermans hit by German shells often caught fire immediately, turning their occupants into near-instant casualties. The tankers knew that their chances in a head-to-head matchup with the Tigers were slim. Some reports indicate that the only viable way to destroy a Tiger with a Sherman was to ambush it from the side, or by attacking in a group, sacrificing vehicles to try to outflank the enemy. It was, in practice, a tactical suicide authorized by a doctrine that had not yet adapted to the new reality. But there was something the Germans didn't understand. Even with all these limitations, the Shermans came back. They were replaced in days. Crews received new vehicles, factories continued to turn, and the flow did not stop. The United States could lose tanks, but it did not lose industrial warfare. And this invisible factor, this silent engine powered by steel, oil, and standardized parts, is what sustained the war until the arrival of something new. The Sherman was the tank of resilience, but never the tank of fear. The Germans respected him for quantity, not ability. And that's exactly what made room for underestimation. When the first Pershings began to appear in the Allied ranks, they were mistaken for Shermans with some kind of modification. The longer gun, the wider turret, the different armor, everything was seen as a variant, never as a revolution. This was the gap that allowed the turnaround. Because while Tiger was recognizable from a distance, Pershing arrived camouflaged, like another face in the crowd. But it was something else. A tank that didn't need evasive maneuvers, that could aim and fire head-on, and win. A tank that emerged from the same system that produced thousands of Shermans, but that spoke a new language, that of technical parity. The Germans did not know that they were looking at the end of an era. They thought they saw more of the same. But difference was already on its way, traveling on rails, crossing the Atlantic, hidden under tarpaulins and false names. And this difference did not have to reach thousands. It was enough to appear at the right moment, with the right cannon against the wrong pride. In the next part, we will go behind the scenes of the secret development of Pershing, a project that began as a response and ended as a rupture. Because to break a doctrine, it was not enough to show strength. It was necessary to show that it was already obsolete, and the T-26 was born with that sole purpose. The development of the T-26 began not as a gesture of ambition, but as a quiet admission that American doctrine had reached its limit. In 1942, as the Tiger Y cleared clearings of destruction on the Eastern Front, engineers in Aberdeen and Detroit were analyzing repeated reports. The 75mm gun was no longer sufficient, the Sherman's frontal armor was vulnerable, and the Germans' ideal engagement distance was far beyond American reach. The solution could not be born on the field. It had to be born on the drawing board. And it was there that the first draft of the T-26 project emerged. A heavy tank with a large volume cast turret, reinforced suspension, redesigned transmission, and above all, a cannon capable of piercing what sustained German morale: the Tiger's front steel. The 90mm M3 already existed, originally conceived as an anti-aircraft weapon. Its projectiles traveled at more than 850 mph and had already proven their effectiveness against high-altitude bombers. Adapting this weapon to a tank was the first challenge. The chamber had to be redesigned, the recoil system recalibrated, the mantlet structured to withstand the impact. The tower had to be enlarged and molded into a single piece, something that German industry had never been able to do at that size. American factories with access to large-scale industrial furnaces and advanced casting techniques were able to produce monolithic turrets with sufficient precision to receive modern optics and shot stabilization. It was industrial engineering turned into a weapon. Meanwhile, the T-26 chassis evolved in parallel. Its HVSS suspension distributed the weight of almost 42 tons more efficiently than the Sherman, allowing for greater stability during firing. The Ford GAF engine, a rugged V8, provided enough power to move the tank with reliability superior to that of German engines, which were notorious for overheating and delicate maintenance. Every component of the T-26 was the fruit of a huge industrial network: steel from Ohio, ammunition from Pennsylvania, optical systems from Rochester, cast-in turrets in St. Louis, transmissions assembled in Michigan, 22 states providing parts that needed to fit together with millimeter precision, and they did. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because all of this happened while the Germans insisted on believing that the Americans were incapable of producing heavy tanks in significant numbers. The T-26 was proof of the opposite, but it needed to remain invisible. Absolute secrecy. The first units were classified as heavy maintenance equipment when they embarked for the Atlantic. The crews were sworn to silence. The tanks arrived in Europe covered in tarpaulins, escorted and unloaded at night. No one could have known that the United States had decided to enter the game of heavy warfare. The crews selected to operate the new tank underwent isolated training at Fort Knox. They learned how to manipulate the fire stabilizer, became familiar with loading APC and HVAP armor-piercing ammunition, memorized emergency procedures, and above all, received a clear instruction. The T-26 was not to be revealed until the right time. American doctrine was not yet completely adjusted. It was necessary to wait. The weapon was too promising to be exposed prematurely. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, German intelligence interpreted American silence as weakness. There were no photos of heavy American tanks. There were no consistent reports. There was nothing to indicate that the United States had surpassed the Sherman's technical level. The OKH and OKW concluded that the Americans were stuck with a doctrine of mass production with no capacity for innovation. The belief was so deep that reports about the long-barreled Sherman began to be dismissed as simple field mistakes. For Germany, if something looked like a Sherman, it was a Sherman, and that assumption would be deadly. The most curious and most tragic thing is that while the Germans were facing increasing difficulties in keeping their production lines running, the United States was increasing the pace. By 1944, American production had not only grown but had diversified. The Sherman line remained active, but now coexisted with experimental production of the T-26. The American Industrial War did not have a single vertex. It was a system in motion, capable of creating alternatives while maintaining the main production. This flexibility was incomprehensible to Germans, accustomed to factories that stopped for weeks due to lack of parts, bombing, or labor shortages. What the Reich saw as American improvisation was actually the essence of innovation. The T-26 was first tested on European soil in January 1945. Each unit landed hidden among ordinary Shermans, waiting for the moment when their presence would be decisive. And the decision came soon. In early March, as it approached Cologne Cathedral, one of these tanks, now redesignated the M26 Pershing, would face its first real duel against German armored pride. The outcome of this meeting would not only justify all the investment, but would reveal the magnitude of the German mistake in underestimating American technical capacity. In the next part, we'll see this secret emerge from the shadows. We will see the instant when the Pershing was finally revealed. Not in reports, not in espionage, but in the mouth of a cannon that would forever change the German perception of the enemy. Because when the first shot crossed the rubble of Cologne, it wasn't just a Panther tower that opened. It was the German perception that broke in half. On March 6, 1945, the center of Cologne was no longer a city. It was an urban carcass. Smoke, ruins, leaning structures, and the black skeleton of the cathedral still standing, like a wounded giant. It was there, between the echo of the bombs and the roar of the engines, that the German doctrine faced something it did not recognize. The lone Panther 213, parked in front of an intersection, was waiting for ambushes from the west. Her crew, experienced, knew that the Americans were close. The commander looked behind the periscope expecting to see Shermans, as always, but what appeared in the crosshairs seemed different. The barrel was longer, the turret heavier, the movement more stable. Even so, the Panther fired. The first shot hit a building, The second ricocheted off the front of the American tank. On the other side, Eagle 7, a newly landed M26 Pershing, commanded by Sergeant Robert Early, remained motionless for a fraction of a second. Then, it advanced. When it fired, the 90mm armor-piercing shell went through the side of the Panther and exploded in the ammunition magazine. Within seconds, the German tank was on fire. The duel lasted less than a minute, but that minute was enough to mark the symbolic turning point of the armored warfare. For the first time, an American tank had defeated a German heavy tank head-on. No ambush, no air support, no numerical advantage. Face to face. The scene was recorded by a camera of the American Signal Corps. The images clearly show the moment of impact. The Panther's turret rotating slowly before internal detonation. The fire spreading inside the metal casing. The footage would become historic. But in that moment, what mattered was not the record. It was the reaction. That shot had broken more than steel. It had torn apart the perception of invulnerability that the Germans had cultivated since Kursk. The Panther, a direct descendant of the German response to the Soviet T-34, was considered superior to anything the Allies could offer. Its high-velocity 75mm gun and its frontal sloping armor had been designed to maintain technical superiority in any theater of combat. And up until that moment this had worked. But now, he lay burning under the shadow of the cathedral, defeated by something that was not in the manuals. The German units in Cologne did not know that they were facing a new model. The OKW post-fight report classified the incident as unexplained urban loss. Without mentioning Pershing, German intelligence still did not understand what had happened. And that, in itself, was the most painful blow. Because if the enemy is stronger, it can adapt. But when the enemy changes form without warning, the doctrine crumbles into the field. The firing of the Eagle 7 was more than effective. It was quietly devastating. German radios did not report a modified Sherman. They reported an unidentified enemy with a long gun, resistant armor, and aggressive movement. It was the beginning of the confusion. And confusion in war is the prelude to collapse. Sergeant Early and his crew continued advancing. They didn't know that they had just gone down in history. But the German tankers who saw the scene knew immediately. There was something wrong with this enemy. He did not back down. He did not hesitate. And his shot was lethal. A report intercepted days later would show the first direct description. Found vehicle similar to the Sherman, but with higher than expected fire capacity. Loss of Panther unit confirmed. Recommendation: avoid direct confrontation. In practice, what the Germans called precaution was in fact the tacit recognition that they were facing something they did not understand. An American tank could now win head-on. And the scariest thing, no one knew how many of them there were. In the next part, we'll find out why this ignorance was even more lethal than the cannons themselves. Because when the enemy has no name, any shadow can be him. And this doubt, more than the shots, is what disarms armies. In March 1945, while smoke from Cologne's cathedral still hung over the rubble, German radios in nearby sectors began recording rambling reports about American tanks with unusual capabilities. It was not uncommon for crews to exaggerate the enemy's deeds. The chaos of war distorts perception. But there was something different about these messages. References to the new Sherman with anti-aircraft gun, thicker armor than that of the Jumbo, and more alarmingly, frontal destruction of Panther in less than a minute, appeared in reports coming from different points on the Western Front. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, was activated. Military analysts were expected to locate the origin and nature of this new threat, but there were no reliable photographs, no intercepts, and no logistical clues about the shipment of American heavy tanks to Europe. What existed were only assumptions, and assumptions do not support doctrines. The Wehrmacht's intelligence arm, already under pressure from the Soviet advance in the East, was now facing a new crisis. There was a new American tank in the field, and no one knew its name, its origin, or its quantity. Experts initially dismissed the reports as misidentification. In the previous months, the Germans had faced the Sherman Jumbo, a reinforced version with extra armor. Maybe that was it. Perhaps some unit was using special ammunition. But when the intelligence team compared the damage recorded on the destroyed Panther in Cologne with the known impact patterns of the American 75mm gun, the discrepancy became evident. Side penetration will pass through the tank with surplus energy, something incompatible with any previous model. It was a new cannon, and consequently, a new tank. The issue that troubled the High Command was not only the existence of this new weapon, but the fact that it had entered operation without any prior sign of its production. German espionage, until then considered one of the most effective in the conflict, had failed. No source had reported the industrial movement in the United States. No network will report on testing at Fort Knox. Not even landings in British ports had been detected. The enemy had not only developed a new tank, he had hidden it in the middle of the war. It was a double whammy, tactical and psychological. An internal memorandum dated March 11, 1945, signed by an intelligence officer of Army Group B, records the confusion. The recent losses of Panther units in the urban areas of Cologne and Remagen indicate the presence of a new Allied vehicle with a gun greater than 75 mm. Cannot confirm identity or number. It is estimated that the Sherman is modified with superior penetration capacity. We recommend avoiding direct confrontations until the threat is confirmed. The language was diplomatic, but the impact was clear. For the first time since 1942, the Wehrmacht ordered its armored units to avoid direct confrontation with American tanks. The doctrine of concentrated attack, of technical superiority, of absolute confidence in German armor began to crumble. The opponent, until then considered predictable, became unpredictable, and this new kind of fear could not be calculated. Counterintelligence services tried to react. They ordered the collection of any shell fragment that could be analyzed. They collected reports from surviving soldiers. They mapped every location where a Panther had been destroyed in urban combat. But the pattern did not repeat itself consistently. On some fronts, the Shermans remained easy targets. In others, the new cannon appeared. This indicated a limited presence, and it was precisely this limitation that most confused the German command. If the Americans had created a new tank, why send it in such small numbers? Would they be testing, or just getting started? And how many more would be on the way? German intelligence, structured to understand a slow, predictable enemy, now faced an enemy that acted like them, with secrecy, innovation, and surprise. And this undermined not only operational confidence but leadership morale. The doctrine of technological superiority had been built on the premise that Americans lacked the industrial capacity for cutting-edge innovation. Tiger was the pinnacle of that belief. Now this base began to crack. The enemy was improvising less and projecting more. Later, after the war, one of the German intelligence service officers interrogated by allies would confess, "We thought we knew everything about American production. They bombed us with Shermans and trucks. We thought that was all. And then, something came along that we never expected. At the end of the war, they were still surprising us." The admission wasn't just about a technical error. It was about arrogance. It was about a doctrine that refused to imagine that the other side could evolve. When the surprise came, it was too late. In the next part, we'll look at how this German confusion didn't prevent, but accelerated, the impact of Pershing. Because if there's anything more dangerous than a new tank on the battlefield, it's an army that no longer knows how to face it. And when doubt enters the tower, the war has already begun to be lost. What started as a technical advantage soon turned into an even more lethal weapon: uncertainty. When the first reports of American tanks with 90mm guns hit field radios, the reaction was not counterattack. It was hesitation. German tankers began to confuse normal Shermans with Pershings at every turn, every ruin, every line of shadow. A tank stopped at 800 meters was no longer a target. It became a potential threat. In April 1945, a report from the 11th Panzer Army recorded an unusual pattern. Armored units were being abandoned even before they entered direct combat, simply because of the suspicion of the presence of tanks with long-range guns. Doubt paralyzed. The logic that had sustained German confidence, superiority in armor, firing distance, visual dominance, was beginning to fail in the face of the idea that the enemy could now fire from afar and win head-on. In cities such as Kassel, Paderborn, and Wesel, Panther and Tiger were found intact, abandoned with fuel and ammunition. The survivors' explanation was almost always the same: "We thought it was the new American model." But the most telling data would come from the archives of the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, where a technical analysis revealed that for every Pershing in operation, at least 3 German tanks ceased to fight, either due to hesitation, abandonment, or excessive caution. He was an invisible psychological multiplier, and at the same time brutal. And now the shock. American production of medium and heavy tanks between 1942 and 1945 was approximately 49,000 units. The German, adding all the Panthers, Tigerswagen, and II, just over 8,800. The ratio was more than 5-to-1. If this surprised you, write in the comments. Absolute power, because this war, in the end, was decided as much by the steel as by the number of bolts. And each American screw came with a manual, spare, and guaranteed replacement. The difference now wasn't just mechanical, it was mental. The battlefield had been transformed into an arena where fear replaced initiative. And the greatest irony, Americans didn't even need thousands of Pershings to create this effect. A few, well-positioned, were enough to spread what the German high command had never been able to contain: doubt. In the next part we will discover how this doubt was amplified by another, even more unexpected factor: Germany's own urban terrain, which, instead of protecting, exposed its weaknesses. Because in the ruins, there is no longer a front line, and where there is no line, there is no defense. There was a time when the sound of a Tiger I starting the engine caused silence on Allied radios. His silhouette commanded respect even before the first shot. The armor of up to 120 mm at the front made it virtually impenetrable to 75 mm guns. Its 80 mm gun, with a range of more than 2,000 meters, was a steel reaper. But by April 1945, on the streets of cities like Dortmund, Dessau, and Hanover, this same Tiger was no longer moving forward with confidence. Reports of the unthinkable began to emerge. Heavy tanks being abandoned with simple flaws such as broken tracks or jammed gears, flaws that months earlier would have been repaired in the field by any experienced crew. Now, the men inside these giants were hesitant, and more than that, they avoided combat. A report from the 507th Panzer battle describes a symbolic incident. A fully operational Tiger I retreated from a defensive position upon sighting what they believed to be a modified turret Sherman. The crew preferred to blow up the tank and flee rather than risk a direct confrontation. What was once pride was now suspect. What was once technical mastery was now fear of the unknown. Because the American 90 mm, even if rarely seen, had entered the minds of men who once considered themselves the predators of the field. The doctrine that underpinned the use of Tigers, concentration of force, armor supremacy, superiority of range, began to crumble. Confidence evaporated. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front now avoided engagements in urban areas. Tanks that once led formations began to hide among ruins, awaiting orders that did not come. The firepower still existed, but the soul was fractured. A commander of SS Panzer Abteilung 502 would record in a personal diary, "The steel is still with us, but the spirit of the steel is gone." This collapse was not just physical or tactical, it was symbolic. The Tiger had ceased to be a hunter, and she had become a prisoner. In the next part, we will understand how this reversal of roles was not just an operational defeat, but the ultimate collapse of an entire ideology, the belief that technical superiority, alone, could win an all-out war. Because when faith in symbols breaks, what remains is only cold metal. By 1945, the European battlefield was no longer a space for isolated heroes or legendary machines operating alone. It was a total gear. And in this new theater, the value of a tank was not just in its gun or its armor, but in the network to which it belonged. The United States didn't just manufacture Pershing, they integrated it. Each T-26 unit sent to the front was not an isolated bet, but a link within a coordinated chain. Infantry, radio, support artillery, aerial reconnaissance, logistical replenishment, and mechanical evacuation. When the Eagle 7 fired on the Panther in Cologne, there was more behind that shot than just sights and gunpowder. There was a doctrine that understood war not as tactical duels, but as systemic operations. American doctrine called for the joint use of tanks, P-47 fighter bombers, M7 Priest self-propelled artillery, refueling trucks, and SCR-508 radios with constant communication between units. That was the real innovation. The Pershing might be new, but the brain that powered it was already mature. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to operate according to a logic of elite units. Tigers were often deployed as independent forces, separated from infantry and supported by limited artillery. Their commanders relied on the individual impact of the machine, not on the collective synergy of the force. It was the old spirit of the Blitzkrieg, now isolated in urban and forest pockets, without the logistical support or the time to react to an enemy that was evolving in a block. Pershing's supremacy didn't just come from steel or design, it came from the doctrine behind it. The Germans saw each tank as a warrior. The Americans saw their tanks as cells of a larger organism. A U.S. Army technical report, published after the Reno campaign, confirmed that 72% of the engagements in which the Pershing was engaged had direct aviation or artillery support. In the German forces, only 24% of engagements with Tigers were integrated with air support, and less than 10% had effective inter-unit communication. The difference was not only in the machine, but in the way it was used. An 88mm gun fired in isolation can be devastating, but a 90mm gun fired with intelligence, cover, and support becomes decisive. A Pershing was never alone, and that was the real weapon. In the field, this translated into quick decisions, course corrections, efficient evacuations, and retaking position in a matter of hours. A Tiger with a mechanical problem without support became static. A Pershing with the same problem was towed, repaired, and returned to the front within 36 hours. The brains of American war were driven by doctrine, but the arm was logistical and unstoppable. The phrase recorded by a commander of the 3rd Armored Division sums up this new vision well. We don't build tanks to win battles. We build systems to win wars. In the next part, we will see how this system reached its apex. Because while the Germans were betting on lone monsters, the Americans were about to show something even more frightening: the standardization of superiority. And when superiority becomes the standard, the end is already a matter of time. The legend of the Tiger was born out of steel, but it died in numbers. Each Tiger I unit required more than 300,000 parts, 8,000 man-hours, and more than 6 months to complete the Henschel line in Kassel. It was an impressive machine, no doubt, but doomed by its own complexity. The 100mm frontal armor, the 88mm KWK-36 gun, the interleaved suspension, the delicate hydraulic systems, all these required millimeter precision, handmade components, and spare parts that, in 1945, no longer arrived regularly. Meanwhile, the Fisher Body Division, a subsidiary of General Motors, was assembling a Pershing every 4 hours. Each chassis was standardized, each module was interchangeable. The engine, the shaft, the turret, even the screws had universal measurements. It was war transformed into a manufacturing process, where the concept of better was replaced by the concept of available en masse. It took Germany 1,800 hours to assemble a Tiger II. The Americans took less than 120 hours to finish a functional M26. And then there was the maintenance factor. A broken Tiger needed railway cranes to be removed. A Pershing could be serviced in the field by a standard service truck. The difference wasn't just one of scale, it was one of mentality. The Germans saw their tanks as unique pieces like knight's armor. Americans saw theirs as tools, and tools need to be replaced quickly, not ritually venerated. The cruel irony of it all was that at the moment when German technical superiority was most needed, it became less relevant. By April 1945, fewer than 60 operational Tiger IX were still left on the Western Front. King Tigers, heavier, slower, and even more difficult to maintain, were often abandoned before firing. Lack of fuel, transportation, parts, and trained personnel made these weapons symbols of past glory, not possible victory. A memorandum from Albert Speer himself, Reich Minister of Armaments, acknowledged the gulf. It is no longer possible to maintain production at a satisfactory level. For every armored vehicle delivered, 3 are lost without replacement. German industry, suffocated by bombings and the lack of raw materials, had become a paper castle. Meanwhile, the United States didn't just produce tanks, it produced whatever came with them: ammunition, gasoline, mobile workshops, medical units, trucks. With each Tiger that broke, a Pershing came to the front. For every Panther lost in a muddy field, an American column fought its way through with full support. In just 12 weeks between February and May 1945, more than 300 operational Pershings were sent to Europe. Germany has never had this number of Tigers available at the same time, not even on their best days. And it wasn't just quantity, it was consistency. The German model was extraordinary but fragile. The American was robust, standardized, and supported by a logistical line that seemed inexhaustible. The doctrine that prioritized individual technical excellence did not withstand the shock with operational excellence at scale. And here, more than at any other point, war has revealed its true nature. Tanks don't win alone. The one who wins is the one who can keep them walking, fed, equipped, and replaced. One piece of data sealed the fate of the German steel monsters. While a Tiger traveled on average 15 kilometers a day before experiencing mechanical failure, a Pershing operated with a range of more than 160 kilometers in the field, with routine maintenance every 80 kilometers. The collapse was not in the pipe, it was on the axis. It was at the foundry that he stopped, in the truck that didn't arrive, on the operator who has never been trained, and in the next part, we will understand how this logic of inevitable attrition was accelerated by something even more merciless than numbers: time. Because in 1945, time was Germany's scarcest resource, and America, with its tanks, planes, and ships, had decided that it was going to crush every second of it. The strength of an army is not only in the weapons it wields, but in the ideas that guide its firing. And in 1945, Germany's armored doctrine was stuck in a past that no longer existed. For 3 years, German tankers were trained to counter Shermans with predictable strategies: flanking ambushes, use of range superiority, open field combat, pincer maneuvers. All this based on an enemy that was numerous, yes, but limited. But what do you do when the enemy changes shape, and no one warns you? When the first clashes against the Pershing began to be reported, the Panzer schools did not know what to answer. There were no manuals, no reliable recognition, no official order. The commanders in the field sent reports full of doubts: new Sherman model, superior armor, unknown cannon. The senior officers, not knowing what they were facing, only recommended avoid frontal engagement, a phrase that, for someone commanding a Tiger, was almost a tactical surrender. The doctrinal rigidity of the Wehrmacht, which had functioned like a well-oiled machine in the early years of the war, was now beginning to stall. The crews were veterans, but they were blind. They were instructed to aim at the Shermans before they reached 1,000 meters. But the Pershing could fire from 200 and penetrate frontal armor. They were trained to engage mechanized columns with ambush fire, but the new tank was supported by infantry, mobile artillery, and constant air cover. Each attempt to counterattack was answered not by a tank, but by a system. In April, a field order sent to the German Ninth Army listed emergency guidelines for dealing with the modified Sherman: fire on the move, target tracks and flanks, retreat if armor is not penetrated in the first 3 shots. It was the doctrine of doubt, and in the field, doubt kills. What was once coordination has become hesitation. What was once offensive has become a weight. With each new encounter with a Pershing, more questions arose. In Kassel, a panzer unit refused to follow a planned route after sighting of American tanks with unconfirmed silhouette. The commander reported, "We preferred to retreat. There were no instructions on this model. It was the collapse of trust and of response." Now for the shock. Between March and May 1945, more than 60 documented cases of German tactical evasion were identified because of hearsay or unconfirmed visions of Pershings. In comparison, the number of actual confrontations with T-26 in the same period was less than 25. In other words, the fear of encountering the enemy was more frequent than the real enemy. If this surprised you, comment, "Shocking data." Because this was the new battlefield, made less of steel and more of imagination. The absence of information created a fog over the eyes of the Wehrmacht, and this fog cost tanks, positions, and morale. Without proper recognition, armored vehicle schools were unable to update their curricula. Newly formed crews arrived at the front, without even knowing the silhouette of the new opponent, and veterans, accustomed to winning, began to hesitate. The silence in the manuals was as deadly as the roar of a cannon, and as the chaos raged in communications, a pattern began to emerge. Tankers reporting targets they couldn't identify, commanders avoiding giving direct orders, generals distrusting their own maps. The Panzer doctrine, once a symbol of German efficiency, was now a broken clock trying to mark the right time in the midst of collapse. In the next part, we will delve into the voices that lived through this crash, the testimonies of the German tankers themselves. Because when fear gets a name, the war changes its sound, And the sound that would come next was no longer the crack of the 88 millimeter. It was the silence on the radio. The tank didn't even need to be there. The possibility was enough. In April 1945, the roads of the Rhineland were filled with rumors. Wehrmacht soldiers reported strange silhouettes in the misty fields. Shermans with longer turrets, some said. A new model coming from the Americans, murmured others. The truth was hazier than the cold mornings that enveloped the German positions. The Pershing had become a ghost, not a vehicle, but a symbol. And symbols, as we know, do not need to be seen to scare. The German tankers had been clearly trained. The Sherman was vulnerable, slow to aim, fragile in frontal armor. His weak point was known, his combat routine predictable, but this new spectrum did not obey these rules. It was unknown. And in a war that required millimetric precision for every decision, uncertainty turned to poison. The 116th Panzer Division's field reports are clear examples of this transformation. In more than 12 documents analyzed between March and May 1945, there are vague references to unknown models, long guns, increased armor, no confirmation, no technical specification, only suspicions. Still, positions were abandoned, flanks were retreated, direct fighting was avoided. In practice, what the Americans didn't know, and what the Germans refused to admit, was that the Pershing had won before it even arrived in the field en masse. Overcome in fear, defeated in reflex, defeated on the map. In urban areas such as Siegen and Hildesheim, German patrols began to avoid areas with greater American armored activity. Even when there was no confirmation of new tanks, the shadow was enough. A similar tower was enough. The rumor was enough. The Panzer doctrine, based on reconnaissance tactics and coordinated attack, began to crumble in the face of superstition. What was once military science has become intuition, and intuition on the field, when misinformed, kills. The radios of the German units, already overloaded by interference, began to register inconclusive alerts. Possible new tank observed. Model not identified to the northwest. Sherman with high turret on the move. They were short messages, full of doubt, but they affected entire decisions. In many cases, these messages were passed on to the high command, which, without confirmation, opted for caution. And caution, for a retreating army, costs territory. The 2nd SS Panzer Division recorded in April a loss of contact with the enemy for more than 24 hours after reports that unrecognized armor was on the southern line. No combat was recorded, no casualties, but the position was abandoned. 1 kilometer less in front, one more piece of Germany given over to doubt. The psychology of combat, ignored by so many theorists, had become the protagonist. The Pershing was, in itself, a limited tank in numbers, but as rumor, it was unlimited. It circulated in the soldiers' speeches, in the margins of the reports, in the scribbles on the maps. He became an invisible entity, and this, at the end of the war, was more potent than many direct attacks, because the soldier who fears what he does not understand does not shoot, and if he shoots, he misses. On the Western Front, there was talk of Ghost Sherman, a model that could not be traced, that seemed to come and go, that withstood direct fire and responded with brutal precision. In reality, it was just the logic of urban warfare added to the punctual introduction of a new weapon, but in the perception of the common soldier, it was a creature out of the manuals. And this has altered combat behavior. In Cologne, a panzer platoon retreated completely when it identified 2 tanks with long barrels crossing the central street. None of them were Pershing. They were British Firefly Shermans. But the effect had already set in. The enemy did not need to win the confrontation. It was enough to be confused with someone who had already won. The irony of it all was that the Pershing, even in small numbers, had become more present in the German imagination than any real Panther or Sherman. It was the weapon of uncertainty. American doctrine never intended to operate by suggestion, but it eventually achieved this result by sheer accumulation of technical mastery. A new cannon, a new tower, a new silence, and all this projected on an exhausted, disconnected enemy, doctrinally blind to react to novelties. In German intelligence reports intercepted by the Allies, almost symbolic passages emerge. There is something new on the ground, but we don't know what it is. This sentence was written by a major panzer in the Harz region. The troop he commanded had spotted 2 tanks in an ambush position and preferred to retreat. The major did not order an attack. There was no instruction. There was no manual. There was only the rumor, and the fear that this rumor was real. What we are witnessing here is not just an engineering duel. It is the exact point at which myth supplants material. The Pershing, quietly designed, produced in secrecy, delivered in small numbers, achieved something that no tiger could in the entire war: operate psychologically even in the absence of it. It was war as theater, as perception, as conditioned reflex. And in this theater, the symbol won over the doctrine. It won the 88mm gun. It won the 6 months of German production. He won the tactics of 1939. Because in the end, whoever controls the narrative controls the field. And the American narrative, even if unintentional, said only one thing: there is something new coming, and you are not ready. In the next part, we will hear the voices behind these decisions. The German tankers who wrote in their diaries the doubt that the manuals did not explain. Because between steel and fear, there is always the sound of an engine that no one recognizes. And this sound, in the spring of 1945, came from tanks that had no name, but already decided the outcome. The impact of Pershing went beyond the battlefield. He cracked not only shields, but certainties, because in 1945, for the ordinary German soldier, and especially for the members of the Waffen-SS, war was no longer just physical. It was ideological. The National Socialist doctrine had built over the years a castle of certainties. The Germans would be invincible because they were superior. His engineering was superior. His race was superior. Their culture was superior. And its enemy, made up of soldiers of a mixed democracy, black workers, Jews, Italian immigrants, women riveting armor in Detroit, was, by doctrinal definition, inferior. But the battlefield now told another story. When an American tank came up and destroyed a Tiger at 200 meters, the first thing that toppled was not the turret. It was the narrative. The Waffen-SS crews, indoctrinated from a young age with the idea that they belonged to a technically and morally elevated caste, began to face a reality that was impossible to ignore. The enemy, which for years had been portrayed as disorganized, fragile, and dependent on quantity, now presented something that Germany could no longer produce: quality at scale. The 90mm gun, mated to the cast turret of the Pershing, was a direct response to the myth of the 88mm. And it didn't just face it. In many cases, it overcame. In post-war interrogations of Tigers and Panthers crews, one phrase was repeated: we didn't know they were capable of that. This phrase, simple in form, was profound in what it represented, because it was not just a technical observation. It was an ideological confession. Germany's armored elite had built its identity on the idea of absolute superiority, and the Pershing, silent, functional, and effective, demolished that identity with the roar of its cannon. The crisis was moral. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as a disorganized force, sustained only by numbers. Hollywood, jazz, democracy, everything was considered decadent. How then had this decay produced an armored vehicle that equaled, and in some cases surpassed, the jewel in the German crown? The answer was uncomfortable. It was painful, because it required recognizing that the basis of an entire war had been built on an illusion. It was not enough to be well trained. It was not enough to have tradition. The world was now made of production on a large scale, standardization, doctrinal integration. And in this new world, the Third Reich was a relic. In the Bavarian camps, SS tankers began to refuse engagements without full confirmation from the enemy. The official reason was a shortage of fuel, of parts. But behind the cold reports, there was something more human: hesitation. When conviction gives way, courage no longer finds a basis. And when ideology cracks, discipline turns to silence. Victory, which was once sung as destiny, now depended on erased maps and mute radios. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years was reduced to improvised trenches and soldiers who no longer knew what to shoot for. The most symbolic thing is that Pershing's presence was not massive, but its impact was, because he was in essence the living negation of everything Goebbels preached. It was an American tank, made by a racially plural, religiously diverse, industrially collective democracy, that defeated the tanks of the supposed Aryan technical empire. It was engineering against ideology, and this time, engineering won. In a letter seized from an officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, he writes, "The new American tank is not a myth. I saw him destroy 2 of our vehicles with shots that we had previously thought impossible. And most disturbingly, it was manufactured by those we despised. That is the essence of dissonance. Pershing wasn't just life-threatening, it threatened belief. And it wasn't just among soldiers. Generals began to reevaluate decisions, avoiding direct confrontations, rewriting doctrines. The technical pride of the Reich gave way to defensive, evasive maneuvers, disconnected from any dream of victory. The last armored academies, such as the one in Bergen, began to revise their curricula, but it was too late. The new war was no longer against tanks, it was against time, and against the lie told for years. Morale plummeted. Radio silence was no longer just a strategy, it was disorientation. The new recruits looked at their instructors and saw no confidence. They saw doubt, and doubt is contagious. A system based on superiority needs blind faith to work. When that faith falters, the system implodes. The Pershing was not just a weapon of steel. It was a weapon against mythology, a symbol that said, "The world has changed, and you were left behind." In the next part, we will look at how this ideological denial extended beyond the trenches and reached the German engineers themselves. Because while the tankers retreated, the designers finally admitted, what the Americans did, we didn't succeed. And the reason was simple. They put their ego aside. In 1945, seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front were deployed to the West, carrying with them the confidence hardened by years of combat against Soviet T-34s and IS-2s. They knew armored warfare in detail, every terrain, every technique, every limitation of their own vehicles and the enemy. But when they arrived in the Rhineland and northern Germany, familiarity turned to uncertainty. Reports began to come in about American tanks that looked the same as the Shermans, but that withstood direct fire from their 88mm, and that with a single shot destroyed a Panther or Tiger. The first reaction of these veterans was disbelief. They had learned to rely on their experience, but nothing prepared them for an enemy that shattered all expectations. Defensive positions, which were once strategic and reliable, have become potential pitfalls. Precisely elaborated attack planning turned into tactical dilemmas. Troops hesitated in the face of tanks they could not identify with certainty, abandoning intact vehicles as a precaution. War for these men ceased to be a sequence of known actions and became an exercise in adapting to an unknown. Each encounter with a possible Pershing required recalibrating instincts that had saved lives in the East, but which could now lead to death if applied without caution. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, and what the Americans had done was simple, efficient, and brutally effective. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. This recalibration syndrome was not just tactical, it was psychological. Elite veterans, accustomed to supremacy, now found themselves vulnerable in the face of a machine they did not understand. Every retreat, every decision not to engage showed that the Pershing had achieved its quietest and most effective goal, the breaking of the unshakable confidence these troops had in their own technical superiority. And as these units adjusted to the new reality, the next turning point was yet to come. The American industrial impact was beginning to manifest itself in incontrovertible numbers, showing that Germany was not only facing new tanks, but a production capacity that could outpace any recovery effort. The war would no longer be just between steel and gunpowder, but between entire systems, and the next part will reveal how this logistical superiority cemented the inevitability of German defeat. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was beginning to realize that it was no longer enough to rely on the experience accumulated over years of combat. The armored units, which had once advanced confidently, began to disintegrate under the pressure of an invisible and systematically efficient threat. Panther and Tiger tanks, symbols of German supremacy, were found abandoned, often due to minimal mechanical failures or lack of fuel, but also due to simple hesitation in the face of unidentified American tanks. Documents captured after the war show a consistent pattern: crews surrendering before even going into direct combat, reporting encounters with modified Shermans who were never actually confronted. Operational disintegration has become a domino effect. Each abandonment encouraged the next, each silent retreat made the neighboring sector vulnerable, and trust, the glue that held the formations together, disappeared. German officials recorded in internal memos that uncertainty about the enemy, and the perception of American superiority generated quiet panic among veterans. It wasn't just fear of the Pershing or the Shermans. It was the realization that American industry could replace losses faster than Germany could produce, rendering any individual or small unit resistance useless. War, which had previously been decided in duels of steel and strategy, was now decided in the perception of inevitability and emotional paralysis. The collapse was not only tactical, but psychological and systemic. In many cases, the German tanks remained intact, but the crew was no longer. A critical shortage of fuel and parts only compounded the effect. But the main factor was the certainty that each American advance carried with it the risk of confrontation with an unknown and ruthless force. Thus, even before the last shot, the war was being decided. And the next part will reveal how this sequence of abandonment and surrender directly impacted the Reich's defense strategy, showing that Pershing and American logistics not only won isolated battles, but shaped the total collapse of German resistance in the West. Decades after the conflict, the memories of German veterans still echoed with the imaginary roar of the Pershing. Many never got to face it directly, but the knowledge of its existence shaped decisions and instilled hesitation. Among the oral and diary records of Tiger and Panther's crews, vivid descriptions emerge. The instant when one crossed the field of vision with a different Sherman, the need to question each silhouette, the realization that any line of advance could mean instant destruction. The 90mm tank thus became more than a machine. It became a psychological myth, a symbol of the turnaround, proof that German supremacy was not absolute. Veteran officers admitted years later that the mere suspicion of a Pershing in the area influenced their decisions more than actual engagement, a phenomenon historians would call intimidation by the unknown. Accounts show that even decades after the war, at gatherings of former combatants, the Pershing was mentioned with silent reverence, as if its impact had transcended the very count of tanks destroyed. The 90mm cannon, although rarely used in combat, remained in the collective memory as the symbol of the breaking of German invulnerability, a reminder that human strength, no matter how organized or technologically superior, could always be surprised. This internalization of trauma marked what many called the end of the Tiger myth. The machine was no longer invincible. The men who operated it were human, and this realization anticipated the closing of the narrative. In the next part, we will cover the final accounting, the production figures, the industrial contrast, and the psychological legacy, showing how only 20 Pershings managed to leave a mark that, in effect, surpassed in impact what thousands of Shermans could never achieve, consolidating the Pershing as more than steel, but as a symbol of the inevitability of German defeat. In 1945, the Pershing episode left a clear lesson that transcends the battlefield. Tanks don't win wars alone. The M26 wasn't just steel and gunpowder. It was part of an integrated system, coordinated with artillery, infantry, communications, and industrial logistics, all orchestrated to maximize effectiveness and minimize vulnerability. While Germany was betting on the technical perfection of its Tigers and Panthers, America showed that the real strength lay in production capacity, standardized maintenance, and the flexible doctrine that allowed each Pershing to be more than a standalone tank. It was an extension of a complete system of warfare. American military documents detail how each tank arrived at the front line with guaranteed support, spare parts, fuel, ammunition, maintenance staff, and coordinated tactical instructions. Germany, with its limited production and its reliance on highly specialized equipment, could not replicate this model. The difference was not just numerical but structural. The Americans had designed an industrial war machine capable of sustaining the pressure of constant combat, while the Germans still depended on the individual skill of their crews and the isolated technical superiority of their machines. This contrast generated the psychological impact we saw along the Western Front. Even when a Pershing was unique in combat, the mere possibility of encountering him destabilized decisions, paralyzed offensives, and accelerated surrenders. The message to the present is clear. Individual heroes, no matter how powerful, do not win wars. What decides conflicts is the system, the ability to integrate technology, doctrine, intelligence, and logistics into a coherent whole. Pershing proved that a well-conceived industrial and doctrinal strategy can overcome isolated superiority, creating a multiplier effect that goes beyond direct combat. And in the next part, we will see the final closure of this narrative, the definitive accounting, the production figures, and how the psychological and industrial impact consolidated the Pershing not only as a tank, but as a symbol of the triumph of one system over another, showing that war is won with ideas, factories, and strategy, not just with steel. In 1945, the war in Western Europe was coming to an end, and with it the complete collapse of the Wehrmacht, which manifested itself not only in destroyed fields or destroyed vehicles, but in the minds of its most experienced operators. The Pershing, silent, precise, and integrated into an industrial and logistical system that Germany could never match, did not need to annihilate hundreds of tanks to win. It was enough to exist, move with purpose, and maintain constant uncertainty about his presence. The myth of the tiger, which for years had sustained trust and awe, has crumbled in the face of a simple, unforgiving reality. Scale production, standardization, and adaptive doctrine overcome the isolation of technical perfection. The veterans of the Waffen-SS, accustomed to dominating battlefields with superior technology and tactical expertise, found themselves powerless in the face of an enemy that operated as a system, not a lone machine. The collapse was not marked by explosions or ricocheting guns, but by radio silence, the hesitation of crews, the preemptive surrender of intact tanks. The war was decided even before the last shot, and Germany discovered that technical superiority alone does not guarantee victory. The universal lesson of this story transcends borders and decades. In war, the ability to integrate resources, intelligence, production, and doctrine is more decisive than the excellence of any equipment alone. What destroys myths, defeats empires, and redefines battles is not just steel, but the strategic thinking that turns factories, logistics, and planning into lethal weapons. The Pershing experience demonstrates that real strength lies in consistency, the predictability of a cohesive system, and the ability to sustain operational pressure long enough for adversity to become insurmountable. Tanks can kill, planes can bomb, soldiers can fight bravely, but if there is no system, the hero becomes vulnerable, and the myth dissolves. One German officer, reflecting on the last months of the war, summed it up with bitter irony. "We were defeated by trucks and factories, not just American steel." This admission encapsulates the psychological and strategic impact of Pershing and American production, showing that the real strength lay in the mind behind the machine, in the ability to conceive, manufacture, and maintain a tank in continuous action. And it is in this spirit that we ask, like the video and subscribe to the channel to support the research and the search for historical truth. Comment on what was the most shocking fact you discovered in this narrative, and activate the bell so as not to miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to reveal. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story. The memory of Pershing, the psychological impact on German tankers, and the demonstration that systems outperform individual machines stand as eternal reminders that, in war and history, coordination, industry, and strategic intelligence decide far more than the raw power of any one cannon. The Pershing's long barrel didn't just kill the tiger. He killed the myth, the arrogance, and showed that even the most feared machines can be defeated by thought, planning, and well-organized production. The echo of this learning reverberates not only in the history books but in every modern military strategy, reminding us that true supremacy is not in the object, but in the mind and the system that sustains it.